Good afternoon, good evening, welcome. Thanks everyone for joining and for coming back to Streaming Media Connect and our research keynote, State of Streaming Autumn 2023, sponsored by Tulix. I'm actually going to share a message from Tulix right now, but I'll introduce myself first. I am Steve Nathans-Kelly, Editor-in-Chief and Conference Chair from Streaming Media, and it's great to see everyone, if I could only see you. And I'm going to share this video now.
Tulix is a leading streaming technology incubator and innovator. Focused on delivering cutting-edge streaming and content solutions, Tulix provides content owners with a reliable platform, data center infrastructure, CDN, and private cloud services. Clients also gain access to best-in-class advertising solutions for content monetization.
And before we get started with this panel, a few housekeeping notes. So the first person to name the music that you just heard, including the artist and the tune, will win a $50 Amazon gift card at the end of the session. But you must be present to win, and you must type that information in the chat. And let's see. So closed captioning is available. We'll have notes in the chat about how to turn that on and off. And as for the chat, please do chat amongst yourselves in the chat. And then if you have questions for the panel, we will take some questions at the end of the session. So just type those in the Q&A panel so we can keep those separate from the chat. Other big news from Streaming Media, we will be back in person May 20th to 22nd in New York City with Streaming Media NYC. The link to that should be in the chat, and also the link for the call for speakers, which is open. So registration isn't open yet, but if you do have a session idea to contribute, go ahead and respond to the call for speakers. And so we've got a lot more sessions today, tomorrow, and on Thursday. And then the complete archive of Streaming Media Connect will be available on our YouTube channel next week. And the link for that should be in the chat as well. So we've been doing state of streaming surveys for a few years now. We do 2 per year, one in the spring, one in the fall. And although we don't ask exactly the same questions every year, we ask enough of the same questions so that we're able to compare the data from one survey to the next and identify subtle and not so subtle trends year over year and survey over survey. And you'll see a lot of those comparisons in the slide deck we'll be sharing coming up. And so first folks I'd like to introduce from the panel are George Bokuchava, CEO of Tulix, and Nino Doijashvili. I hope I got that even somewhere close to right. George is the CEO, and Nino is the Executive Vice President. Thank you all once again for sponsoring our State of Streaming survey, and it's great to have you on the panel for commentary. And so Nino, if you could turn your camera on, and then George and Nino are going to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about them and about Tulix, and then they're also going to introduce 2 other members of our panel from Skreens who are wanted me to mention are finalists in the Reader's Choice Awards, the Streaming Media Reader's Choice Awards in the Best New Streaming Innovation category. But now I will pass it over to George and Nino from Tulix, who are part of our Streaming Media 100 as well as the sponsors of this survey. So Nino and George, welcome.
Thank you. George, go ahead.
My name is George Bokuchava. I'm CEO and co-founder of Tulix Systems located in Atlanta, Georgia. We're in the streaming business for over a decade now, and we're focusing on providing the best services in the area of CDN, playouts, and custom solutions. We're helping to a lot of startups and other companies to come up with the solutions that never were built before. And one of our differentiation is that we all now own infrastructure. We're using others, but we also have our own infrastructure, which makes a big difference for many installations. Thank you.
Thank you. And then my name is Nino Doijashvili. I'm doing a business development with Tulix. I work with partners, customers, with streaming landscape companies and so on. And it's my pleasure to introduce our partners, and then we are working on some projects together. Skreens, Lynn and Marc. And then please, Lynn and Marc, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nino.
I'm Lynn Birch, one of the co-founders and chief product officer of Skreens. Marc?
And my name is Marc Todd. I'm the CEO of Skreens. And so Skreens is a cloud-based ultra-low latency video streaming and personalization platform. We specialize in super ultra-low latency video editing and distribution. And very appreciative of Tulix and Streaming Media Connect for inviting us to the panel.
Thanks, Marc. Thanks, Lynn, Nino, and George. Now, I would like to welcome Tim Siglin, Executive Founding Director of the Help Me Stream Research Foundation, contributing editor for Streaming Media for 20 years now, and also the research analyst for the State of Streaming Survey. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Steve. And coming to you from the Western North Carolina, Northeast Tennessee, Southwest Virginia mountains, I can attest that the sheep are indeed still in the meadow at this time of year. So, and as Steve mentioned, I guess now I've been writing for Streaming Media for almost 24 years. It's hard to believe that streaming's been around for quite that long. We've only done these surveys for the last 4 years. This is actually our 8th version of the survey. And given the time constraints, we're going to go ahead and hop right into the first couple slides. These first couple slides, we're just going to basically set the demographic model for you to understand who took this survey. So for the first time ever, we actually now have representation across 6 continents. Steve, if you can pull the slide that actually shows the map of the world, that should be, there we go. We have representation from 6 continents. We haven't had anybody from Antarctica take the survey yet, but hopefully at some point we can get somebody to do that. As you can see with the breakdown here, still predominantly a North American response group. Europe has risen a bit. Actually, all across the board, we've seen rises, with North America dropping back to about 75%. If we go to the next slide, what we'll see is that we have, and this, I apologize for this slide, it's a bit of heavy eye candy, but I'll sum it up for you. What we ask people to do is not only tell us where in the world they're from, but to self-identify the industries that they work in. And what you'll notice on this is we've got representation from a large number of industries, from finance to education to motion picture news organizations, professional consulting services, production companies, etc. The 2 major points I want to sort of draw your attention to here is this is the largest representation of the 8 surveys that we've had in the channel space. That's the one up in the top right corner. 20.7% of our respondents actually say that they work at either a Big 5 channel or say a premium cable channel. That'll be important a bit later as we go down through the survey. The second area I want to point out is education and religious organizations. When we first started this survey, they were pretty low. That was pre-pandemic. They rose during the pandemic, and they've continued to stay consistent through here. So we'll have time for Q&A at the end. I'm going to go ahead and move us along then to the next slide. So the next slide, beyond just saying where are you from and what industry are you in, we ask people to tell us the makeup of their streaming services. So if they do streaming, where do they find the percentages fall? And what you'll notice, where you'll want to focus on this slide for this current survey, is the dark blue color that's on here. And that dark blue color shows us, essentially the breakdown across 100%, the mix for people. You'll notice education, houses of worship, as I say, are consistent. One area that seems to be dropping, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is news publishing. That consistently from its highs back in the 2020 timeframe has continued to drop. Now, given the fact that we're a fairly North America-centric survey, we could potentially blame that on the election cycles. But what we tend to find in news is that live doesn't tend to attract quite as much, short of major breaking news events, as the on-demand, and on-demand is falling off across the board. And I'll come back to talk about that in a few minutes as well. On-demand content clearly has stayed at its high. It seems to take over at least a quarter of the market every time. I'm going to jump on to the next slide, and then I'll bring a couple things to George and Nino here. This question we have also asked from the get-go: does your organization create or distribute media? And when we first started out, this was about 47-48% who said we both create and distribute media. The rest was fairly consistently cut across only create media or only distribute media. Now what you can see over time is it's risen. It's gone as high as 74% of respondents saying that they create and distribute media. Falling back a bit in this survey, in the only distribute media portion, which is on the left, and it's 16%, that's actually the highest that we've noticed over the last 8 surveys. And George, I know we've talked before about this. Do you get the sense that we're seeing more organizations say, look, I may not have original content, but I know how to put a platform together or utilize a platform to distribute media for other content owners?
Yeah, and actually it's very interesting graphic can say so. Like, for example, what we see on the right side, both create and distribute the media. Actually, I would say it's misleading, but we need to understand that it's not like content creators creating their own CDN. It's not like they're building CDNs or they're building platforms, and actually they're utilizing companies like ours, which we white labeled for them. And this is what, in my opinion, they count as them doing or preparing content and distributing, doing distribution too. So when we talk about only distribute media, it's just classical CDN. So someone just purchase CDN, let's say. But when they're building their custom platform, like I said, then they feel like it's their platform. But obviously, it's not like they have in-house data center, they have in-house, all the technology and all the stuff. They're outsourcing to companies like ours. But the point is here, again, they feel it like it's theirs, and obviously it's theirs, but they're still utilizing third-party companies like us. And this is, I think, what being represented on that graph.
Okay, good. And let me make one clarification from the previous slide. We'll get to Q&A later, but somebody asked clarifying that I just happened to see. Question about live events and sports being separated. Specifically, the way the question is worded, and we've left it this way from the get-go, is live events, when you answer the survey, has in parentheses after it an EG that talks about concerts and non-sports events, and then sports themselves being a separate category, because some of that can be live. That's what we tend to traditionally think of with sports. And that, of course, was the last great big holdout for people cutting the cord to come over to doing OTT only, was live sports. But there's just as much sports content that's actually recorded and then played back in a live linear fashion. So that's sort of how we differentiate between those two. If you'll go on, Steve, to the next slide. So here we ask each time, tell us what your typical viewer or subscriber size is per month. And traditionally what we've seen is that the low end, the 1 to 100 and the 100 to 500 has made up roughly half. What we're noticing in the last few surveys, though, is those are beginning to drop back And what's beginning to happen is a rise at the upper end of the market. So say 1,001 to over 10,000. What's really interesting here is the middle of the market, this 501 to 1,000 has been dropping away relatively consistently over the last few surveys. We've had some conversations about this in the pre-call, and I'm just going to summarize real quickly so that for time's sake, but essentially what we tend to see here at the low end of the market, and what we saw when we asked open-ended questions where people provided their own response, was they would typically say, look, if we're just getting started or if we're small, we're going to use free platforms. And they make sort of a distinction between a platform and a CDN. So we're going to use free platforms. At some point, they reach a viewership level where they have to begin to pay for those platforms. And that seems to be a barrier to growth, where they move from, oh, I've got an audience that I feel comfortable with that's small, but the moment that it gets a bit larger, I'm suddenly in a position where I may not be able to fund that. If you can cross that chasm and get into this 1,000 and above, it seems like, you know, obviously that's going to be paid. That may be, as George said, using a paid platform. It may be using a CDN, et cetera. Let's jump on, though, to the next slide here, and let's look at the over 10,000 as we've seen that over the course of the last 8 surveys. What you'll notice is back in 2020, and we have the average here because it's really tight to try to cram all 8 in here. In our pre-pandemic survey, this was around the 32% mark. It rose post-pandemic at late 2020 to be up in the mid-40s. So our average there was about 39. You see that those have declined, but now they're starting to climb back up at this point. And one point we made last time at Streaming Media East was a lot of people say, I'm going to plan for 10,000 or more, but oftentimes they come much shorter of that in the first couple years that they're actually in business. And George, Nino, I know that was a big conversation point at Stream Media East. Do you all want to add anything on this particular one where we're starting to see an uptick again above 10,000 monthly viewers or subscribers?
Yes, I think, you know, like because of the, now we have a more combination, not just subscription, but also the FAST, we do see that growth. And then the more interesting business models are emerging for that matter, but absolutely.
Okay. Let's go on, Steve, to the next slide. And I'm just going to point out a few things here, and then we've got a slide that's a little less busy than this. If you take a look at the 22% on the left-hand side, that was from spring 2020. So that is the 1,001 to 10,000 viewers monthly. You'll see that if you look all the way to the right, that has stayed relatively consistent. So that upper middle of the market, so to speak, has not fluctuated hardly at all across all 8 surveys. On the other hand, if you look at the top corner there, you see that 39 or 40% back in the spring, dropping off of 2020, dropping off as we came down into 2022 and flatlining a bit in early 2023 and recovering again, now back at 36%. The point on this is to show that we have relative consistency across periods of time, despite the fact that we have multiple different respondents. So what we're really then looking for is what happens when we get those wild springs. And Steve, if you can go to the next slide, this may make the point better of what I was trying to say a few slides back, in that, actually back one, Steve. as I said at the top, we've got the over 10,000, which went from 40 down into the mid 20s and is back to 36. What you'll see too is the low end of the market has risen slowly. We got a bit of a bump last time, and then we're back down to about baseline on that 14% versus 9%. So the other major part that I was saying about the middle of the market, that 500 to 1,000, you can see that that's been in decline now for a year. So they're really, my sense is there were a couple things that happened there. One of which is cloud services, were really, really pushed in 2022, but then people got the bill for that. And suddenly it's trying to figure out how to sustain the model as everything from batteries to bandwidth is rising for the delivery side of the house. And of course, the cost of acquisition is rising. It creates a major issue in the middle of the market. If we can then go on to the next slide, Steve. So in this next one, we're looking at video revenues, annual revenues for video in both traditional and streaming. In this case, this has not shifted significantly at the lower end. I would say on average, it's been 45% of respondents have said, look, we're living in this world that we're under $100,000. And if you take the combination up to 499,000, you can see that equates to 50% of of the market. I'll open this up to any of the panelists. Does it surprise you that there are so many companies in the industry that are sort of just barely getting by?
Not really, actually. We have a pretty good experience with multiple broadcasters and multiple content owners, and we see how they're struggling actually, and the industry is coming up with different models. Would it be subscription basis, will be marketing related, fast channels and all this stuff, but still on a smaller scale, there are still a lot of difficulties. Content owners have a lot of difficulty with generating sufficient revenue to support them. Now, if we switch to the greater than 100 million, what we're talking about, and I think we had this kind of idea, I think it relates to mostly increasing prices. So it's not even, number of subscribers, but it's maybe, we know that also major studios increases their prices for, per subscriber. But on a smaller scale, actually, content owners not only cannot increase their prices, but they're hardly making some revenue just to support themselves, at least most of them. But there are always exceptions, but we're talking about most of them, which are hardly making.
So just to recap that point, when you're a small organization like that, you may not be able to raise your prices, where obviously we've seen significant price increases for the upper end of the market. And in fact, we'll go to the next slide here, and I want to show sort of a fluctuation at the upper end of the market. So I wrote an article based on some of the open-ended questions that we asked in this, called Pricing Pain Points. It's on the website now. It'll, I believe, be in the magazine in the next issue. And one of the pricing pain points is precisely what George described, which is the cost of everything is rising. And because the cost of everything is rising, there's that push on the upper end to raise revenues. We've seen in quarterly earnings in the last couple of days just how there have been some missteps in the industry. There are some moves to push down not allowing 4K streaming in particular premium services, et cetera. If you go back and look at the Pricing Pain Points article, which Steve has actually posted in the chat, one of the comparisons I draw in there is just how rapidly we've seen a rise in the cost of OTT subscriptions, specifically for on-demand subscriptions, the top 5 that are out there. That's reflected somewhat here in the 2023 spring and autumn, but if you remember current news, there has been both the crackdown on password sharing, and there's also been a rise in almost 40% over the last year in the cost of subscription. So this has clearly caused some impact on the upper end of the market. So to me, while I think it's interesting that we go from 8% in spring 2023 to 13.5% in the current one, I don't know if that's a sustainable model. I think we'll have to, sort of look at that over the next couple surveys. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. This is average resolution of content. So if you look at autumn 2022 and autumn 2023, they look fairly consistent. We had a bit of a anomaly in the middle in spring in terms of 1080p popping up, 1080p 24, 25, 30, but it settled back down here to being roughly a third of that. What's also quite nice is that we've seen the 50, 60 frame per second rise back to the point where it was. And specifically, we've had consistency in the 720p 30, 720p 60, and we're getting back to about 27% on the 1080p 60. And Lynn and Marc, I know you all work in a company that sort of focuses on live and ultra low latency. What do you see in terms of content being delivered in 60 frame a second versus say the classic 24, 25, 30?
Right, you want to take?
Well, I think you're with the ultra low latency and the live events, and online betting and such, you end up needing more of the 60 frames a second. So I think you'll start to see that continue to creep up as that becomes more of an industry.
Also, 60 frames a second is also very prevalent in sports. It's hard to watch a hockey game, for example, in 30 frames a second. So we see that both for the timing element and also the resolution. We also don't see the 4K. This data makes a lot of sense. We're not getting a lot of call for 4K at all, actually.
And yeah, that's probably the last thing I want to point out on this slide too, is that we have seen a consistent drop from highs around 8 to 9% down to 3% now. So as much as the industry loves to tout 4K, in reality, I don't think there's still a large market for that. And in fact, if the OTT premium providers are any harbinger of what's to come, the fact that we've had announcements here recently where they're taking 4K out of some of the top tiers means that, they're probably delivering to audiences that don't necessarily need to see it in 4K. And I hate to say need to, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes here, future slides.
And actually, important slide. So if I may add also, 4K just too much trouble. Compatibility with different devices, creating multiple profiles, HEVC, not HEVC, which are actually being converted obviously the cost. So I think there is just two kind of directions which are getting to HD 60 frames per second. As the reason is why it's mostly more devices support now 60 frames per second, because before there were some devices which were not handling that well. And on the other hand, a lot of companies understood that instead of going to 4K, it's much easier just to increase the frame rate and get not similar result, but better results than the previous resolution. So I think this is what the major explanation, in my opinion, at least, for increasing
Very
HD.
Good. And I think too, I'll point out that 720p 60 takes up slightly less bandwidth than 1080p 24, 25, 30. So if you're in a limited scenario now where you want to increase your audience by adding, say, live sports, but you don't want to double up on the bandwidth to go up to 1080p 50 or 60. It really does make sense to consider 720p 60. Steve, let's go on to the next slide. And I'm just going to briefly touch on this just for limitation of time. You can read more about these things in the report that will be coming out in about a week and a half. What you'll notice here is we've got, again, there's a bit of an anomaly in the spring 2023 survey, but we're seeing the sweet spot still sitting between 5 and 8 megs a second. The upper end growth on this one, where we have this more than 15 megs a second, honestly, I think that's an anomaly that we'll need to watch. It could possibly be because we've had some very, very high profile live sports events, everything from the World Cup of Rugby, cricket, soccer, in the last 6 to 8 months, and the Women's World Cup of soccer. And so I think there is a model where people will say, hey, I want to see if I can view that in 4K, because you want to be able to keep track of the ball, etc. However, having said that, I think that it goes back to the bandwidth concern. If bandwidth prices are rising, a provider, if they can get away with doing 1080p 60, or if they can get away with doing 720p 60, would be much more likely to offer it to you in that scenario. All right, if we can go on to the next slide. So here we talk about frequency of live events, and we're shifting a little bit toward the live only. When we asked people if they did live events, and they told us yes in a particular question, we then said, tell us how frequently you do live events. The takeaway on this slide is for spring 23, you can see that 3 to 5 times a week was 21% of the market, and 16% of the market said they did it more than 5 times a week. Now in autumn, we've got a quarter of the market saying they're doing more than 5 times a week. So we're seeing growth in frequency of live events. And I think that's to be expected, but it's also the fact that what we're seeing is there is a shift toward live being dominant in the industry as opposed to on demand. So if your company is focused on getting eyeballs, the freshness of eyeballs comes along with live as opposed to with on demand. And Marc and Lynn, of course, again, you work in a company that focuses mainly on live. Are you seeing the frequency of events rise? I can't remember if your business model allows for people to do individuals or if they're doing continuous live.
Yeah, our business is actually does editing the video live on the fly, and we're seeing once people get their system set up that they're able to replicate those events over and over. And we're finding also more customers who are putting more content that hasn't been streaming before and getting that out with the desire to start slow and build it many more times per week.
Okay, interesting. Let's go on to concurrent viewers, and then from that we're going to talk about some of the different revenue types. So here we've got the average concurrent viewers. Again, the most recent survey data is in the darkest color block here. One of the things that I'll point out here is that it seems like we're getting a bit of growth toward the upper end of the market. In this case, in the question we asked before with the middle of the market, we sort of asked both on demand and live. In this one, we're specifically asking, what's your live composition in terms of concurrent viewers? Because that's obviously where the biggest cost comes. What you'll notice is the middle 5,001 to 10,000 has risen to 8%. The 10,001 to 50,000 is sort of staying relatively close to where its average is, and then the more to 50,000 is rising slightly at the expense of the fewer than 500 side. So this one, by itself doesn't create a trend, but it's certainly interesting to see that where the middle of the overall market is dying, it seems like we're getting some traction to the upper end on concurrent viewers. The next slide, we're going to then talk about where people view content. And this goes partly to the conversation around 4K. Somebody made a comment in the chat section that consumers aren't ready for 4K. I would argue consumers aren't ready to necessarily sit and be tethered. And in fact, tomorrow I'm going to do a research keynote that talks about the types of devices that people consume on. But here is a general overview. If you look at the topmost numbers, you see that battery powered is about 43%, mains powered or tethered devices is about 57%. That number's not shifted significantly over the last 3 surveys. So it tells me, again, because we had different respondents to each of these and we've got relatively consistent answers, that this is a good baseline to consider in the market. If you're only pushing toward mobile, you're missing more than half. If you're only pushing toward connected TVs, set-top boxes, that kind of thing, you're missing half the market. And there are different needs for content delivery to the big screen as there are to the small screen. So when you think about things like 4K, while the audience might want to watch it in 4K on the big screen, if they then want to step off the biggest screen they're close by and use a battery operated device, there's no reason for them to be using 4K at that point. Any comments, Nino? Actually, do you have any insight on this one, or do you want me to go on to the advertising part?
Like this is absolutely right. So we are handling such type of situations, and we do know that connected TVs are slightly higher, but mobile is right behind, or a battery-based devices. So this is very good confirmation of our experience. Thank you.
Yep, and this is a good chart for another group that I'm involved in besides Help Me Stream Research, where we research ways to take old tech to turn it into streaming for parts of the world that don't have internet connectivity or streaming. Also worked with Greeningham Streaming, and we want to understand in this, it's not just about making it a more efficient connected TV, it's also about making more efficient delivery to battery operated devices as well. Steve, if you can go on to the next slide. So in this next slide, we ask a question across the board that says, okay, tell us how you support your consumer-facing business. And when we first started this out, back when Eric Schumacher Rasmussen, who's chairman of Help Me Stream, was the chair of the streaming media conferences, we argued as to whether free was a model. It turns out free is consistently a model. I mean, you could argue part of that is the free and freemium, but to be honest, there are a number of organizational types in the industry, whether it's government or houses of worship or to some extent education, who have a mandate to deliver their content for free. And so those, when you look at the comments, people will say, we're covered by donations, we're covered by grants, et cetera, et cetera. The other main point that I want to point out here is advertising only, has stayed in that 14 to 16% range. That's something that the industry keeps talking about, that we need to go to advertising focused. Some argue, okay, we'll do a subscription with ads. You see that that's actually a fairly low group in the market. But advertising only, has been a big push. And in fact, FAST is part of that conversation, free ad-supported television. So let's go into taking a look at a couple of those things here, because I think this is a key point on the next slide. We've asked now over 4 surveys, tell us about your FAST plans. And as you can see, relatively consistently, 55 to 65% saying we don't have FAST plans. So now let's focus on the other 3 groups, the stage 1, 2, and 3. And what you'll notice is that we have seen a bit of an uptick at the upper end of it. This 16% in stage 3 is the highest that we've had in terms of survey respondents, which then lets us have a conversation about, okay, if advertising revenue is how you fund your company, how well are you doing at funding the company? And the next slide that comes up here, let me explain a bit on this. If you look at the left, it's tell us the percentage of your business breakdown. How much does content cost you percentage-wise for every expense that you spend? How much does the technology cost you? And how much is your administrative overhead? And this has remained relatively consistent, that a third on content side, 45% roughly on the technology side, and the rest on administrative overhead. Now, George, I want to come back to you because you said something earlier where you said, the costs are rising, and I've seen that in what respondents have told us too, in terms of their cost of delivery. How do you think, if we look forward on this, the technology aspects of acquiring or delivering the content are going to play out over the course of the next, say, 6 months?
Thank you. This slide and the previous slide, I think it's a very interesting slide because overall direction of the industry is moving towards a revenue generated by fast model or ad revenue model. But there are a lot of challenges and there are a lot of complications, and I think a lot of companies are still thinking about getting revenues to the fast model, but at this point they're holding off. And the main reason because actually the content owners, the key is the viewership, and a lot of content owners who wants to get revenue, obviously they weren't able to get enough viewership subscription model, so they decided to go with a fast model, counting that if it's free that people start watch, but it's not always working out. And the reason is here because just putting a channel online, which has a fast model, revenue model, doesn't mean that viewers will show up. You have to put on a specific platform with already pretty big viewership, and then you have a chance. But to get to the big platform, then platform may not want to put you there. So as you can see, it's like chicken and egg kind of situation. Regarding technology, and this is very interesting, that on one hand it's a pretty complicated technology because of multiple moving parts, like Scotty markers, like ad markers, like manifest manipulators, and all this kind of stuff. But on the other hand, I think this 42% that we see over here, it's we have several leaders in the industry, and I think they're just getting a big cut of the revenue and justifying that cut by the technology expenses. In reality, just their business model, which allows them to do that. It's not real technology expenses. It's just a business model which grabs a big chunk of the revenue. So my point is here that the model, if we'll take a look on the left side, the middle, technology-related expenses, like I said, it's not technology expenses, maybe, in my opinion. It's just technology company are getting into the ad revenue to get a piece of it. And this is so why we see that on the higher side. But it's not really technology expenses.
Okay. Well, and just to sort of hammer that point home, if the cost is rising even somewhat for the technology related pieces, the larger platforms can opt to raise their price significantly, which then will impact the overall percentage of expenses within a content owner who's trying to distribute on that particular platform. To the right side, advertising revenue and covered cost. We started back in autumn 2022. So at the Streaming Media West conference in Huntington Beach, we were asking questions around, okay, tell us how much of your technology related costs are covered by ad revenue, how much of your overall costs are covered by ad revenue, and then what is your percentage of advertising revenue on average compared to the other revenue that you bring in. want to focus really quickly on those bottom two. As you can see, we've got somewhere in that middle one, we've got somewhere between 30% and 38% overall cost covered by ad revenue. And we've got about 25 to 30% of costs for technology covered by ad revenue. This continues to be a major problem for me, that if the industry is assuming that it can just sustain itself on ads, it's clear from this model that we've seen now across 3 surveys that that's not really probably likely going to happen. If we go on to the next slide, what you'll see here is we then ask people a question about how many ad markets do you typically use? And the key takeaway on this one is while we're seeing consistency in the 2 to 3 and 4 to 5, we're seeing a drop away of those people who say I only use 1 ad market, and we're seeing growth on those who use more than 5 ad markets. One of the open-ended responses that people, that a respondent mentioned, was that they can't find the ads that they need to be able to deliver the number of ads that they want to be able to cover their revenue targets. And George, I think you were saying in a pre-call conversation that there are some low-end fast channels that even when they launch, even if they can get the viewers, they're not necessarily able to get the ads to serve.
Yes, so this was our experience with many parties that were working with partners and customers of ours. That we're launching the fast channels, and very often we see that ads are not being served. And this is, I think, twice as bad for the content owners. The reason is why, because they're still paying for CDN, but they're not getting the revenue from the advertisement. So it's not only they're losing revenue, but they also have additional expenses which are not getting covered. And this is terrible, in my opinion. But this reality, and I think this is the reason why the alternative what the content owners are trying to do, they're just trying to go with more ad markets with the hope that they'll get fulfilled as close as possible to 100% of their ad breaks. So this is what we see on the graph, in my opinion.
Got it. All right. And Steve, let's go ahead and hop on to the next one. In fact, when we ask people how satisfied they are with their choice of ad revenue options, you can see that there's more neutral, and there's a much larger percentage that are neutral. If we look to the right, how satisfied are you with the cost of your market is equally as big and neutral. So it seems like, to bear out what George was saying here a minute ago, and to bear out anecdotally what respondents told us, there's higher cost than they expect. There aren't as many ads that they have access to. And so it creates a model, if they're focused mainly on fast revenue, that for a lack of some of those things, they may not actually be able to survive. And I don't want that to be a downer. I just want that to be a reality check in the industry. If we can jump on then to the next slide. And Steve, I'm going to go ahead and skip over this one for lack of time. Let's then talk about platforms that people use. And if you notice in this particular grouping, when we ask people to tell us about video delivery solutions, they're looking at things like YouTube, they're looking at things like Vimeo on higher levels than they're necessarily looking at things like AWS and Akamai. That's not to say, from the overall standpoint, that free and freemium are the models that the industry relies on to be able to make revenue. But it is interesting to see that consistently across surveys, YouTube and Vimeo and others like that are checked off as being options that respondents use. If we will go on then to the next question.
If I may just go back just for a second. I'd like to clarify here, because it's maybe again to like when we're looking at YouTube, we're talking about actually number of broadcasters who are utilizing YouTube, but we're not taking into account number of viewers. So what does it mean? We may have 1,000 channels being broadcasted on YouTube, but maybe having just 5,000 viewers, just as the sake of example. In reality, it could be, other CDNs, which may have less than 1,000. Let's say they have 100 broadcasters, just comparison compared to thousands, but they may be serving 50,000 viewers. So here again, it's a number, as I understood, it's number of broadcasters utilizing the services, but doesn't show you the number of viewership. And I think number of viewership or number of viewers is also very important, which we may address in the later, research documents.
Okay. Fair point. We'll have to wait till the report for that, given the lack of time here. Steve, just briefly, the next one is we asked people about public cloud versus private cloud. You can read a little bit about this in that pricing pain points article. What I will point out here is the arguments for private cloud that people told us versus the arguments for public cloud are almost the same. The cost on public cloud was essentially, hey, I'm starting out, I'm small, I can use the public cloud because it's less costly for me. The arguments on private cloud for cost, it was, oh, I've grown big enough that my public cloud bill is higher than I expected, therefore I'm moving into building out my own solutions. Security was another one of them. On the public cloud, people said, well, I rely on the platform to do my security for me because they're doing that security for everybody. On the private cloud, the argument was, well, I don't trust the security of the public cloud. I'm going to do my own security and make sure that I, keep my content secure. And then speaking of sort of the operational cost, the next slide touches on the OpEx and CapEx and the like. And for two main points here that I want to make before we go on to Q&A is operational cost has consistently made its way into our conversations about business and technical concerns. CapEx has only begun to make its way into the conversations over the last 3 surveys. So if you go back through all 8 surveys, operational cost will be in the top 5 concerns. CapEx has only risen to be in the top 5 concerns and is now about the second highest concern only within the last year. And I think, again, that has bearing back to this. We're getting bills for public cloud that are higher. We need to think about building out our own solutions. Steve, we can skip the next slide around the organizational goals. That will be in the report. And we go to and we'll skip latency. So let's go on to the last slide here, which is data centers. Edge computing is obviously a big buzzword still in the industry. And what we're seeing, if you look at these topmost numbers, is that when we ask people to tell us about their edge compute strategy, the number of respondents who said they're going to use smaller regional data centers so that they're closer to the customer and can lower their overall latency has continued to rise, where the number of respondents who said they're going to stick with a large data center model has continued to decline. And with that, I think we should open it up to questions and answers.
Yeah, so we've got some questions that are specific to certain slides. So I'm just going to stay on the slide deck for now. Yeah, Eric Walsh asks with regard to slide 11, could this slim margin of revenue be a cause of traditional companies making the shift toward digital, i.e. the added CapEx, OpEx to stream, develop, and maintain a digital product?
So, Eric, what I would say on that, and then George, I'll let you answer. One of the things that came through loud and clear in the open-ended responses is the frustration that those who work in those large companies have with the slowness of the transition to streaming. So it could have some bearing here, but I also get the sense that there's quite a bit of, still quite a bit of resistance to moving the whole kit over to the streaming side.
Yeah, and if I may add, actually, these slides represent exact current status of where we are at. And I'm talking specifically Tulix systems, and obviously there are multiple other companies in the same area, which it's regarding CapEx, regarding public cloud, and all this stuff. And I'm really displaying what I'm talking about. So we're in talks now with several good-sized companies, actually, which are now in the public cloud. And what we're offering to them, actually, to purchase an equipment, which is a CapEx expense, would be a CapEx expense for them, and then serve them out of our small data center, if you remember, because we have a relatively small data center compared to the largest ones. And there's a reason why smaller data centers, in my opinion, are more plausible or more attractive than the large data center, because large data centers usually like for general use. It's hosting, it's like mail, website, and all this stuff. While small data center, specifically ours, and I believe there are probably some others too, which are specifically designed for live streaming or streaming overall. So the cost cutting they're getting, it could be 60+% of OpEx, which is a pretty big number in my opinion, just by switching from public cloud. When you purchase equipment, yes, you have one-time cost, but then OpEx, which is actually, you multiply a year and you're getting huge numbers if you're staying with public cloud. But this is what we see, and we didn't see that 6 months ago. There were here and there, someone was showing up, but now we have some number, the biggest number of those parties which actually want to move out from public clouds. Plus, there's some instability from business models. We know that some public clouds are quitting streaming services, so you never know what's going on. And we have a large data, multiple terabytes of storage, and we're dealing here 50 to 100 to 250 terabytes of storage per installation. Then imagine just migration and what kind of risk and how long it will take to migrate, which also one of the things that you need to address, probably someone needs to address this. So they're thinking about in advance to moving all this stuff off the cloud, just do not get problems which will not have time to fix, let's put, by migrating or something like that.
Very good.
Right.
Steve, the questions about the presentation and that kind of thing, I'll just touch on those briefly. So if you have specific questions about breakdown, revenue on types of content, etc., Tulix actually receives all the raw data from this, and that might be an interesting conversation to have with Tulix, because they can then break some of these things down for you more if you have very specific questions. In terms of copies of the presentation, every one of these charts that's in here will be in the written report, which has been is about 95% done with these charts and should be out within the space of the next week to week and a half. So you'll get a chance to see all of that particular data. And then Steve, I think you said there's an archive of this presentation that will also be available online. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the archived video of this presentation will be on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/streamingmediavideo. And then the report will be available on streamingmedia.com probably in a week and a half or so. We're at the top of the hour here, so we just need to wrap up with a couple of things. So we just want to announce, I don't know if either of these survey respondents are here, but we just want to shout out to them for the giveaway for the survey itself. We have an $100 Amazon gift card winner, Callie Rutledge of First Methodist Church of Albany. And an Apple Watch winner is Ken Wilson, International Children's Care. So congratulations, both of you. If you're here, you'll be hearing from us about that.
And for those of you who take this survey, go all the way through to the end and then put your name in, or your email address, in, so that you can get registered to win this, because we can't offer the prize to you if you don't provide that detail.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm going to unshare here. And we'll actually be doing the next streaming media state of streaming survey in the spring and presenting it live at Streaming Media NYC in New York City. That's probably going to be May 21st or 22nd. of next year. And before we go, I just wanted to announce the winner of the $50 gift card from the Name That Tune at the beginning of the session. That tune, of course, was the great Doc and Merle Watson with Stony Fork and Sheep in the Meadow. And the winner, the first person to get the artist and the tune right was Garrick Huey. So Garrick, you'll be hearing from us as well. So join us back here in a half hour for another great session, Up and Away, Cloud Workflows for Streaming and CTV. And I want to thank all the amazing panelists we had on this session, especially George and Nino from Tulix. Thanks for sponsoring this. And Marc and Lynn, thanks so much for being here and for your contributions. And of course, to our research analyst, Tim Siglin. So thank you all for joining us.
Everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.